Okay, Dr. Edward Jenner was born in the 18th century, and he was a proponent of inoculation and vaccination. Now, there are slight differences to the two. When you inoculate somebody, you scratch an infection under the skin. When you vaccinate, you are injecting a weakened version of a disease into the human body so the body can produce antibodies. So basically, Jenner is at the end of the 18th century as a doctor, going around the country, mostly from his home in Gloucestershire to London and back again, trying to conduct research into the effectiveness of vaccination. And actually, the first person that he's recorded to have vaccinated is his own baby son, who he infected with swine pox in the hope that as a lesser version of a disease, that similar diseases, most notably smallpox, could be avoided if a baby had been exposed to swine pox. Now, Jenner's idea is not entirely new. In fact, it's an ancient tradition. Thousands of years before, in ancient China, in ancient Indian medicine, healthy people would be given powdered pox scabs. The scabs would be crushed and powdered, and people would inhale them. Healthy people. The idea being that would help them to avoid the disease. Now, that process was known as variolation. So the idea wasn't new, but still took a lot of people by surprise. Imagine trying to persuade people for the very first time that the best way to avoid a disease is to be, exposed to a little bit of it. You can see why people would be unwilling to support that. But what you can see here is Jenner's first inoculation with the aim of eradicating smallpox. In 1796, there was an 8-year-old boy called James Phipps. And what Jenner did is he knew of a local milkmaid who had contracted cowpox. Now, the milkmaid would often come into contact with cows and their udders, and that is how the milkmaid got cowpox. So she touched infected cows' teats when milking the cows, and she'd got cowpox. Now, cowpox and smallpox were very similar diseases. They looked similar in the early stages. They were very closely related, but smallpox was much more likely to cause long-term damage or even death than cowpox was. So what Jenner does is he takes a pus from a cowpox sore from this milkmaid, and he inoculates James Phipps with it. So he scratches the infection under the surface. And that's in May. Now, within a couple of weeks, he notices that young James is suffering from the symptoms of cowpox, but soon recovers. Then in July, Edward Jenner exposed James to smallpox, a similar related form of the disease. And when he did that, James showed no symptoms whatsoever. So what Edward Jenner had done for the first time is he had discovered a link between previous exposure to this similar disease and later immunity to it. Now I'm going to tell you why smallpox, and the reason being is it was so common and so deadly. What you can see in the first picture are two brothers from Leicester, and one of them has been given the smallpox vaccine, the other one has not. And I'm not going to insult your intelligence by asking you to guess who has received the vaccine. But smallpox was an incredibly infectious disease, and it had been for centuries. Very easily passed through direct contact, or what we call droplet infection, which is a cough or a sneeze. Now, within 12 to 14 days of coming into contact with smallpox, the symptoms that you might see would first of all include a headache and a fever, backache and shivering. So much like influenza, much like if you've got a bad cold or the flu, maybe you get those symptoms. But then 3 days later, what happens is what emerges are itchy spots all over the body. Those spots turn into blisters, which are first of all quite watery, but eventually fill with pus. The spots then fall off, leaving the victim horribly scarred. Now, if you're lucky and you're in the 50 to 60, maybe 75% of people that survived, you may only suffer those short-term effects. However, some more critical effects included brain damage, permanent deafness, pneumonia, kidney diseases, and between 25 and 50% of victims died after contracting smallpox. Now, famous victims include Queen Elizabeth I. She famously survived smallpox, but the reason why very pale makeup became very popular in Elizabethan England comes from Elizabeth's own vanity. After she recovered, her face was horribly scarred from the effects of smallpox, and she used this very light white lead-based makeup to hide the scars. And of course, if the people at the top of society are dressing and dressing themselves up in a certain way, other people follow. So smallpox is to thank for the very light makeup craze of the Elizabethan era. Another famous survivor of smallpox is King Louis XV of France. He was that badly scarred that some people would noted that it looked as though he had two noses because of the scars on his face. In the century before Edward Jenner was born, so we're looking at the period 1650 to 1750, 60 million Europeans will have been killed by smallpox. So it's quite clear as to why Jenner dedicates his life researching this disease, because it's so common, so easily caught, affects people at the top and bottom of society, and it's so deadly. 60 million people in 100 years. It's a huge number. So the reason why he dedicated his time to researching smallpox is because it was that easily spread and easily caught. So after his work, he first of all inoculates James, but then later when three men contract cowpox, he conducts more research into inoculation. In 1798, Jenner finally releases his research, and it's a 75-page document. But because he's consistently updating his work, he produces updates in 1799 and then again in 1800. And as I've said before, he faces huge opposition. And we're going to look at later on into the 1860s of the Anti-Vaccine League for even more opposition to vaccination. What didn't help Jenner was quack and unqualified doctors. Because what they did is they tried to produce the sort of work that Jenner didn't do as good a job of it, and it discredited Jenner's research. One example is a doctor called Dr. Pearson. He tried to inoculate 14 people with cowpox and told them it would protect them from smallpox. But because the cowpox and smallpox sores looked so similar, what he actually mistakenly gave them was smallpox. All 14 of those people became ill and one of them died. And it was events like that led to people opposing Jenner's research and Jenner's theories. One person that didn't, though, was King George I. And in I said first then, I meant the third. So we'll just put G the 3. So in 1800, King George III meets Jenner, and he asked him to vaccinate a whole army regiment. A year later, he was asked to do so for the Navy as well. And what that does is that starts to improve Jenner's reputation nationally. Because if it's good enough for the king and it's good enough for the armed forces, it's good enough for everybody else. So, Jenner himself is going into some personal financial difficulties during this period, because he's not doing his day-to-day work as a doctor, because his research is taking up all of his career. So what the king does is the king persuades Parliament to give Jenner £10,000 in 1801 for the work that he has done. And later on, Parliament gives him another £20,000 in 1806. And what that helped to do was improve not only his own financial situation, but it allowed him to dedicate his time to his research and to trying to spread his vaccination theory throughout the country. Jenner's influence doesn't just remain in England. In 1801, Napoleon Bonaparte sends a French doctor to meet with Jenner to discuss Jenner's findings, and upon return, Napoleon insists that the entire French army is vaccinated against smallpox. In Russia, the emperor ordered all children in the Russian Empire to be vaccinated. By 1812, 1.2 million had received the vaccination. Nice, easy figure to remember, because it's 1812 and it's 1.2 million that were vaccinated. In 1802, the Danish government began to vaccinate its children, and by 1810, there were no cases of smallpox recorded in that year. So in a short period of time, the country saw quite rapid results. And President Thomas Jefferson, who was president from 1801 to 1809, insisted that his whole family be vaccinated after hearing about Jenner's work. And so what we can see here is that Jenner's work was significant, not just in England, but across Europe and across the Atlantic to the United States as well. You may be thinking about, when I'm talking about the influence worldwide, cases of smallpox. Smallpox has been eradicated. The last case was in Somalia in 1977. 3 years later, in 1980, the World Health Organization declared that the disease had been eradicated completely. As I've said before in the course, though, don't think about the progression of health as a simple straight line from poor health to the good levels of health that we have today. There are setbacks, and so we come to the sort of back and forth of the mid-19th century. Now, in 1853, the British government made the smallpox vaccination compulsory for young people. To some, that was a great intrusion into their lives, and they didn't feel comfortable with the government telling them what is right and for their children. So 13 years later, the Anti-Vaccine League is set up. And it argues exactly that the government is forcing parents and forcing families to undertake this risky and unproven medical procedure. And what you can see in that source there is you can see people being inoculated with the cowpox infection, and then them turning into these sort of mutated human beings, and we can see cows sprouting from their bodies, people growing horns, people vomiting cows. So the Anti-Vaccine League was basically arguing two things. Number one, these vaccinations don't work. And number two, that it's not the government's job to tell parents what's right for their families. The government reacted in 1871 by telling people they could be fined if they didn't listen to the compulsory order. So what happened in the 1860s, amongst this sort of anti-vaccine feeling in the country, is the level of people getting the smallpox vaccine drops. The government realises it needs to do something, so it tells people that they could be fined for not doing so. And the Anti-Vaccine League are furious about this, and they write articles and tell the story of a family with a heavily pregnant woman, and the government debt collectors came round to insist that they paid the fine for not vaccinating their children. They threatened the father with prison, and upon hearing the news, the mother, who was heavily pregnant, went into early labour and delivered a stillborn baby. So the Anti-Vaccine League were using these stories that were intended to scare people and to play on their fears to disobey the law. What actually happens, though, with the threat of the fine is that generally vaccination levels grow back to a reasonable level. But what's quite interesting is that some years later, in 1887, parents are given the right to refuse. And that was done because vaccination levels were relatively high, and because by the end of the 19th century, it was generally accepted that vaccination for smallpox was a good thing. But what it's led to today is parents still have that right to refuse. When the health visitor came round to give an early health assessment of my baby boy, we were asked if we were intending on giving him the MMR and polio vaccines. So you still have that right to refuse today. Before we move on to the modern anti-vaccination movement, of course, vaccination didn't just end with smallpox. The other diseases that harmed and in some cases killed people, especially children, because their immune systems are underdeveloped and vulnerable to disease. Some of the diseases that are now almost eradicated have vaccines that children are given, and that includes polio, diphtheria, measles. We're going to talk about measles in a minute because it's back on the rise, whooping cough, and tuberculosis. So Jenner's idea, although it faced opposition, led to similar vaccinations and the eradication of some diseases. But we are going to talk about the case of measles on the next slide.